The legislation scrap the scheme and return water assets to local councils. A kaiawhina for Te Ti Marae in Waitangi is relieved the crowd on site is peaceful, despite anti-vax and anti-lockdown protesters joining from parts of Northland this afternoon. The He Whakaputanga Declaration of Independence has been commemorated at the marae. Te Ti Kaiawhina Wairete Paura says anyone wanting to acknowledge He Whakaputanga can come, but COVID-19 protests will not be tolerated.
They aren't welcome. If they come here and protest anti-vaccine, and we've made a stand with that we won't tolerate those kind of protests on our whenua. That's not what our celebration is about.
Wairete Paura says the pōwhiri at midday called for calm. Police remain on site to ensure health orders are abided by. Consumer New Zealand says New Zealanders may be paying too much for electricity because the big generators have too much power. A report by the Electricity Authority has found Meridian and Contact Energy's cut-rate deal with Rio Tinto, the owner for the Tiwai aluminium smelter, has led to higher wholesale prices. The Chief Executive of Consumer, John Duffy, says that's not fair.
The contract is significantly underselling the cost of generation. So Tiwai is getting a really good deal, and consumers are having to subsidise that contract to the tune of about $500 million a year.
John Duffy says if people think that's too much market power for one company to have, they should tell the Electricity Authority, which is seeking feedback on its findings. It's 5:04. The Black Caps are acutely aware their title ambitions could be on the line in the next T20 Cricket World Cup match. After losing their opener to Pakistan in Sharjah this morning, New Zealand now face a crucial encounter with India in Dubai on Monday. Only the top two teams in each group advance to the semi-finals. With India also losing their first game to Pakistan, New Zealand coach Gary Stead says Monday's match takes on huge significance.
I guess if you look through the seeded teams and the way it's going, you would imagine that Pakistan are probably hot favourites now and our group to be the number one seed. And there's probably the rest of us that are fighting out for that next spot, which makes the next game versus India pretty critical.
The Football Ferns have turned in a much improved performance against Olympic champions Canada, going down 1-0 in Game 2 in Montreal. After losing the opening match 5-1, New Zealand looked much more resolute on defence and more creative on attack. A stoush is brewing between the federal and Victoria state governments over whether unvaccinated tennis players can play at the Australian Open in January. The Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, says unvaccinated players will be able to come to Melbourne as long as they undergo a mandatory 2-week quarantine. But the Victoria Premier, Daniel Andrews, says his government won't be applying for travel permits to allow unvaccinated players into quarantine.
The race to 90% vaccinated.
We just need to get open. People are on a knife edge, whether they're going to go under or survive.
A slice of normal for students.
It was amazing. I loved it so much. I just didn't realise how much fun it would be to chat with people.
And zero tolerance for the anti-vax crowd.
That anti-vax brigade, the Billy TK thing, connected with American Trump supporters, calling it a decoy, they're really a bit of an insult.
You double dose. Morning reports weekdays from 6 on RNZ National.
And now the short forecast from mid-service to midnight Thursday for Northland, Auckland and Coromandel Peninsula. Not too good for picnic weather really, mostly cloudy with isolated showers but fine spells expected maybe later this evening. Waikato to Whanganui, also Bay of Plenty and the Central High Country often cloudy with rain at times. For Gisborne, cloud increasing, rain developing tomorrow afternoon. Manawatu and Hawke's Bay to Marlborough and Westland north of Fox Glacier. Scattered light rain or drizzle, heavier and more widespread for a time tomorrow with thunderstorms possible in the South Island. For the remainder of Westland and Fiordland, cloudy periods and a few showers. Canterbury, Otago and Southland, low cloud or fog in the east and elsewhere tomorrow morning. Scattered showers in the afternoons and evenings with isolated thunderstorms and hail from South Canterbury through to Southland today. And for the Chatham Islands, low cloud or fog with occasional drizzle today. It's 5:07.
Nā mihi mārama, tēnā koutou katoa no mai haere mai ki Checkpoint I tēnei rā, ko Lisa Owen tēnei. School's still out until November 15 at the earliest for some of the youngest school kids in Auckland and Waikato. That's the provisional return date set by the government, but it's very much indicative. School's back in real-life session for years 11, 12 and 13, but for years 1 to 10, the learning is still happening at home. When primary schools return, the government is looking at bubbles, outdoor lessons and days on and off. We sent reporter Nick Trubridge and cameraman Nick Monroe to Auckland's Onipoto Domain playground to ask parents how they feel about that.
The good old playground slide. Fair to say it's been getting a bit more use than usual over the last 10 weeks with kids out of school. But it's also a bit of a sign of something else, and that is parents wanting a bit more light at the end of the tunnel.
I think we're just getting a little bit sick of being strung along and not really knowing, when normal life is going to return for us and our kids, yeah. But I know what they're trying to do. They're trying to keep us safe, and that's important too. I just think that they should be a little bit smarter about it, about the way they, feed out information to us.
But let's say schools do go back on November 15. Well, some parents have concerns about bubbles. If my kid's in a bubble, who else are they going to be mixing with?
So we had a concern because not only the kids, the bubble in the school classroom setting that have been run by the school staff, but because of we have so many family bubbles which allow them just gather 2 or 3 bubbles together. So we don't know whether there's maybe a possibility of the community, contact and cases which might are likely to affect the kids' safety as well.
And what about outdoor learning that's been touted as a bit of a solution? Well, some parents here at Onipoto Reserve have concerns about Auckland's tropical climate.
It's very hard, it's very weather dependent. Auckland schools typically tend to be quite large. My children go to quite a large, typical Auckland school. So my question would be how they're going to manage things like playtimes and lunchtimes. But there's huge benefits of the children being back face to face and seeing their friends and being with their peers and interacting again. Like that's been lacking for so long. That's just as important as any academic learning, really. It would be nice to see the kids go back before the end of the year so they can have some sort of, tidy end to the year. It would be such a shame if they spent the rest of term 4 at home, online learning.
One thing's for sure, most parents are more than ready for the kids to go back.
Yes, please go back to school. It's just very straining on the parents when you have to work from home. Like I know the office will say it's not the same, but there's still the pressure. And it was a choice when I want to work full-time and not to stay at home with the kids. It was my choice, and now I couldn't have that choice. So yes, I'm really eager to see the kids back to school. And it's for the kids as well. They miss their friends. Like whenever I'm in my Zoom call, they want to see different faces. So I think not being able to see their friends from school is getting really hard on them.
But what about online learning? Well, it may have been good for a while, but safe to say the novelty has well and truly worn off.
Oh, no, it's a juggle because you've got various Zoom meetings. You have about 1,000 different codes to log into the various programs, and we're also both trying to juggle working full-time from home and running school from home for 1 or 2 children. And also the programs that they use are great and the teachers have been amazing, but you do need to supervise them while they're using them, so you can't just kind of log them on because they get distracted and they don't focus and they can't read the instructions. And so it's actually a full-time job, homeschooling, as well as a full-time job working from home, so it's hard to do both.
But there's one thing above all else, and that's parents crying out for a bit of direction from the government.
And we'll speak to the COVID-19 Response Minister, Chris Hipkins, shortly. If you were listening on radio to that piece from our 2 Nicks, do check it out. The video will be online. People in parts of Waikato and King Country will join the picnic club from midnight with restrictions loosened slightly. Hamilton, Raglan, Waipa, Waitomo and Otarahanga districts will stay at level 3 until at least Monday. But from midnight, they can do things like join another household outside, go hunting, fishing and even scuba diving. Andrew McRae reports.
Of the 74 new community cases today, 6 of them are in Hamilton. It brings the total number of cases in the Waikato King Country lockdown area to 97, with 5 still remaining unlinked.
It's not fully contained yet, where, for example, some of today's cases are currently in central Hamilton. So we're aware that we're dealing with cases. We want to still give Hamilton and the Waikato their best shot at stamping out the outbreak, and this is the way that we can do that.
COVID Response Minister Chris Hipkins says the cases in the region are mainly confined to people who haven't been part of major exposure events. But he says the outbreak has been hard to stamp out.
As with some of the other groups that we have dealt with, this is a more difficult to contact trace group of cases.
Hamilton's Mayor Paula Southgate says it wasn't the news she wanted to hear, but understands it and says the government's playing a very cautious hand.
The relaxing of some of the restrictions would be welcome. It does mean that more businesses can get into action. It does mean that people who have been lonely in their smaller bubble can now get some support, some social support from friends and family within limits. It means we can enjoy our outdoor space a little bit more in those slightly extended bubbles. And so, that's all good for the social and economic well-being of Hamilton, really.
For John Robertson, who heads the Waitomo district, the easing of restrictions isn't enough for his residents.
We look forward to the announcement now on next Monday night about it. And if we sit in Waitomo, for instance, in our district, we've had no cases of COVID down here. And so, given the impact on business and so on, I think it would be good if we can get through to next Monday without any cases to see some real easing, perhaps back to level 2.
Liz Stolwick is Deputy Mayor of Waipa. She's pleased residents are getting some relief with the lessening of restrictions.
I have seen over the last few days tempers really start to flare and a massive amount of anxiousness just appear in just the last few days, to be honest.
It was busy on the main street of Dawamutu this afternoon as locals picked up the news.
Don't really know what's going on, so just roll with the punches, really. Yeah, like I say, I'm not too worried either way. I'm double vaccinated anyway.
If Auckland can do it, we can do it. And I feel like the only reason that Auckland got to do it is because there were so many people not actually sticking to the rules, and I feel like if that's the only reason, we should be moving to.
It's gone on for too long, and we have so few numbers. I don't know that this has been managed as well as it should be.
I think for people's mental health, that's a really positive thing.
Well, for us personally, it doesn't make much difference because we're a family unit, all living together, and I'm working from home.
I think we should just listen to what they're saying, what the experts say, and follow it, because some people just don't do what they're told.
Vaccination rates across the Waikato DHB area now stand at 85% of the eligible population having one dose and 68.2% now fully vaccinated.
It is almost 16 minutes past 5 and you were Checkpoint on RNZ National. Kia ora watu mo te whakarongo mai. Thanks for listening. Our haere aki nei, coming up, the firestorm brewing over the country's water. Ko taku manuhiri anai nei ko Chris Hipkins. Joining us now is the COVID-19 Response Minister, who's also the Education Minister. All the fun portfolios. Good evening, Minister.
Kia ora, Lisa.
Why didn't you just call it quits on primary school face-to-face learning this year? Why didn't you just call time on that and give parents some certainty today?
Well, we do want kids to be back in the classroom as soon as it's safe to do that. We have to acknowledge that, COVID-19 is now, getting back to zero in Auckland, not going to happen anytime soon. We are going to have to learn to live with COVID-19 in the community, and we will also reach the point where we'll have to do that around the rest of the country as well. We obviously want to get our vaccination rates up higher before we do that. But we want to get kids back in school, and we want to do that as soon as it's safe.
So you've got advice coming in the next week. So will you actually make a solid decision next week and announce it next week?
We'll make a solid decision as soon as we can. We've set out a date, the 15th of November, as being the indicative date of when we think we could potentially have primary school kids back at school, not full-time, so they'll be rostered potentially so that we can keep group sizes smaller and minimise the risk. But we do want to get those kids back into school, and so we're working on getting plans in place to be able to do that.
But that's a short runway, Minister, and you have said that you're asking for the advice back within the next week, and schools need time to prepare, so presumably you'd have to announce it in the next 7 to 10 days, what you're actually doing.
Well, that's exactly what we're doing at the moment, working with schools to make sure that they're prepared and to make sure that what we come up with is workable, because we don't want, to have panicking or for there to be uncertainty or confusion about exactly what we're doing and exactly what's required.
There's sort of uncertainty at the moment, and speaking to parents, as we have on this program, they're kind of sick of the uncertainty. In fact, some of them say they feel like they're being strung along with the announcements. So, couple of things. Did you give or are you giving any consideration to shortening the school year for primary students and giving parents an end date for teaching at home?
Well, shortening the primary school year isn't necessarily going to help much of the pressure that we're getting from parents, which is that they want to get the kids out of the house for a little period of time, shortening the school year is not necessarily going to help them with that. In fact, if we get
it stops them juggling work and online teaching at the same time, though, and that is a bit of an issue for them, a big issue.
Well, I think if we can get kids back to school, even if it's only for a couple of days a week, I think that will absolutely help those families who are struggling to juggle both of those things. So that's, if we can do that safely, that's absolutely what we want to do.
How confident are you of that 15 November date? Because parents don't want false hope. So how much confidence do you have?
I mean, I think one of the issues around uncertainty is, we're dealing with a virus and, unfortunately the virus doesn't, give us an indication of what it's going to do next. But if we see our case numbers stable and if we see that we're, managing case numbers in a way that, gives us confidence that we can get kids back at school with the risk being relatively low and with those extra protective measures in place, then I think that the 15th is absolutely a deliverable time frame.
So you don't need case numbers to go down, you just don't need them to go up too much higher.
Sorry, we wouldn't want to be seeing massive spikes in case numbers.
What would you consider a massive spike? Because obviously we've gone over the 100 mark on a daily basis. So what kind of levels of cases would stop you going back on the 15th of November for primary school?
Again, I wouldn't, and I think we've gone through this before, but I wouldn't necessarily put a numerical target on it. Some of it will be a question about the nature of the cases. So how many of those people are ending up in hospital? What kind of age groups and demographics has COVID-19 found its way into? I think those are the kind of questions that, there's still a lot of uncertainty around that. But the situation in Auckland, case numbers, yes, they've gone up, but they have actually they've sort of stabilised at around that sort of under 100 or either just over or just under 100 marker, and if they stay stable at that level, that would be very encouraging.
So year 9 and 10s, are you least worried about getting them back on campus? It's not as important to get them back on campus.
Oh, it's important to get all kids back onto campus.
So why no indicative date for them and no solid plan?
The challenge with year 9 and 10 is we have prioritised those students who have exams or assessments that they have to do, and that means that we've already got quite a critical mass of students on our secondary school sites at the moment. Even if we were to bring back limited numbers of year 9 and 10s, they'd be coming to a school campus that's already got a lot of people on it, whereas with a primary school we can roster kids in and out of school so that we can keep numbers manageable and to help to minimise the public health risk that way.
So unlikely that those kids will be back this year?
Well, it is possible that they'll have some time back in the classroom this year because, of course, our senior secondary school students, once they start their exams, aside from when they're there for exams, are often a general off-site anyway. So by the time we get to that point, I think it is quite possible that we could see those year 9 and 10s on site, at least for some of the time.
FDA has today, their technical committee, approved Pfizer, the pediatric vaccine, for 5 years plus. And you've told us previously MedSafe is watching this evidence as it comes to hand, not waiting. So I'm just wondering, has New Zealand signed a purchase agreement already for pediatric doses, or do you use the doses we already have if we were to approve it for 5-year-olds and up?
We have an option within our existing agreements with Pfizer to have access to pediatric doses if pediatric doses were developed. Now, bear in mind that when we signed those agreements, there were pediatric doses. So that's one of the things that our technical experts will be following very closely as to what nature of the pediatric dose is. Is it just a diluted version of the adult dose, or is it a different vaccine? So we'll be looking at that very closely. But yes, the question mark will be if it's a pediatric dose, how soon can we get access to the pediatric doses?
So, two things there. What is the option? So, do you, in the contract, do you have a guarantee of a certain number of doses, and if so, how many?
I don't have the contract in front of me. I know that the contracts do state, we will have the ability to access pediatric doses, but we don't have a delivery schedule for pediatric doses because, of course, they've only just been approved by the FDA.
Understand, but there's a big push to get everyone vaccinated who can be, right? So if this is rubber stamped, how soon can you start rolling it out to 5-year-olds plus?
If it's approved by MedSafe here in New Zealand, and depending on supply, if we can access supply, we're good to go as soon as supply is available, as soon as approval's been given.
Okay, so what, if they approved it, as long as you've got the product, you could start rolling it out within 24 hours of an approval?
Very quickly. I mean, it might take 48 hours or something, but it would be within a few days.
You were supposed to announce MIQ changes today, right? And that hasn't happened. So what are the sticking points?
Look, it's largely just working through details. One of the things that we want to be able to do.
So which particular ones have you got a problem with?
Well, what I can say is what we want to be able to do is set out a bit of a roadmap about, because there'll be some immediate changes, and then we also wanted to be able to signal what the longer term for MIQ and for those coming into the country, and when I say longer term, how things might roll out over the next few months. We wanted to be able to work our way through that. The situation is changing and evolving and changing pretty rapidly, and so we want to be able to give people a few more markers in the road, and we want to be able to do that tomorrow.
Okay, so you met with ministers this afternoon, so it's locked and loaded and you'll definitely announce it tomorrow?
There will definitely be an announcement tomorrow, yes.
And how far into the future will you give details about how MIQ will operate? Because you said it's a roadmap, right?
Yeah, we will set out the roadmap forward, what people can expect to see. We might have, the further out you get this, the timeframes don't become
So is it a 3-month or 6-month plan? Can you just give us an indication?
Well, what I will set out is what the plan will depend on, because not all of that will be completely within our control, but I will set that out.
So will changes that you announced tomorrow be in place in time for Christmas?
That's going to depend on a couple of things. It's going to depend on vaccination rates. It's going to depend on whether we start to see cases popping up across other parts of New Zealand. So there are still some things that we have to consider. One of the challenges here is that the international border applies to the whole of New Zealand, not just to Auckland. And so the risk assessment in Auckland is certainly different to how it is in the rest of the country at the moment. That's quite challenging to try and create a system that would treat Auckland differently insofar as international arrivals are concerned.
Appreciate your time, Minister. That is the COVID-19 Response Minister, who's also Education Minister, Chris Hipkins. Homai o whakaaro, we would love your feedback. Nō reira anei na kaupapa mō te hōtaka nei. Okay, penciled in date for the return of primary school, 15th of November. How confident are you that your kids will be going back to school then, and would you be happy for them to go back? And what about years 9 and 10? Not such a solid plan there. Pātui mai, text me 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, or send us an email, checkpoints@rnz.co.nz. Despite a flood of opposition, the government is going to force councils to get on board with their 3 waters reform. The proposal has been about 4 years in the making and aims to dramatically improve drinking, storm and wastewater with the creation of 4 large water entities across the country. The government says the status quo is not acceptable and it intends to proceed at pace. Here's our political editor, Jane Patterson.
The government's been making the pitch for 3 waters reforms, but most councils aren't buying it. Local Government Minister Nanaia Mahuta continues to make the case.
Boiled water notices for drinking water affects approximately 40,000 households. Beaches are closed due to wastewater discharge. People are getting sick, approximately 34,000 per year. because of drinking water.
The fatal Havelock North water contamination put real momentum under water reforms, and now a new model is on the table. Local water assets would be transferred to 4 regional entities under collective ownership. Up until now, it had been an opt-in model, but now council participation will be mandated through legislation.
This is an all-in approach that will require legislation, and it will require every council to be a part of a quantum shift in the way that water services are delivered.
Christchurch Mayor Leanne Dalzell accepts the need for reform, but argues this is not right for her city.
I think it's extremely disappointing that they've decided to push ahead with what we've looked at as a flawed model here in Christchurch.
There'd be 4 regional representative groups, 1 for each entity, with a 50-50 split between local councils and mana whenua. They'd appoint an independent selection committee that would in turn appoint the boards to govern the entities. Auckland's Phil Goff says his council doesn't oppose reform but does oppose this model. He says Auckland's interests would not be adequately represented.
This model means that 28% of council's assets effectively go outside of its control to a new entity in which Auckland is offered a minority share in an oversight committee that has no power. That is not acceptable to us.
Hastings Mayor Sandra Hazelhurst says the Havelock North water inquiry had led to big changes in the region, and Hawke's Bay councils had worked hard to deliver safe drinking water.
I'm absolutely devastated about today's Three Waters announcement. Our community are really, really angry. Everywhere I go, I hear people talking to me about the Three Waters. They're talking about marching, and they won't believe the approach of mandating the Three Water entity model.
Timaru's Nigel Bowen has a blunt assessment.
Confiscation of for us, over $500 million worth of assets, and government is saying its ownership remains with council, but it doesn't give you the same rights.
Not all mayors are adamantly opposed. Hamilton's Paula Southgate says it's disappointing to see the mandate, but she'll keep fighting for the best deal for her city.
Council has unanimously decided at this stage to work with government and to continue to press for what's right with us. We did unanimously agree that we wanted further community engagement.
The Minister Nanaya Mahuta says the case for change is strong. She says some mayors have been spreading misinformation to protect their own interests.
Councils will continue to own water assets alongside other councils within an entity. So again, I want to be really clear for those councils who are still perpetuating that myth. It is deliberate and it is misinformed.
The National Party's Chris Hipkins says the government's now shown its hand.
The big sort of asset grab, it's a big drive around centralisation. Frankly, it's taking power and control away from communities, and what the Minister said, we're all in on the legislated 4-entity model. But that model is fundamentally broken, it's unworkable.
National would repeal the legislation and return the assets to councils. ACT leader David Seymour making a similar commitment.
Well, if the government steals it, ACT will be campaigning to return stolen property.
The plan is now to have legislation introduced by the end of the year that will establish the 4 entities and mandate council participation. That would pass sometime next year, with the aim of having the entities in place and operational by July 2024.
Glass has been raining down in central Wellington today, closing part of Lambton Quay and surrounding streets. Our reporter Kirsty Frame joins us now from, that location. Are you safe there, Kirsty, for a start?
Yes, we're very, very safe here. In fact, the street has just opened up in the last few hours, but we are standing at the site where a large window pane fell to its death this morning and even took out some of the glass awning above us. So it was quite a mess along the street today. A lot of glass that went all across the footpath and further out in the road and caused a large disruption, I think, for a lot of commuters, a lot of traffic as well, because the street was shut off for most of the day.
Yeah, it's a really busy street, Kirsty, and people who are listening rather than watching, I'm watching the footage roll out now, and it's pretty dramatic. I mean, how far up the building was this pane of glass, and how far did it kind of skittle when it hit the ground?
So it was on the 20th floor of this building, so it was quite a significant drop and it shattered very suddenly. I spoke to someone this morning who was there when it happened, so it happened at 6 a.m, and he said he heard a very loud bang, and suddenly there was an explosion of glass all across the street, and he even said that someone was walking nearby pretty soon before it landed, so he said there was a very close call there. It was quite a lot of disruption throughout the morning as well, because the window had not completely broken off, so a lot of glass was still falling throughout the morning, and in fact abseilers ended up scaling the building halfway through the morning to remove the rest of the glass, and by doing that their only form of removal was to drop it back down onto the street. So there was a very wide cordon in place for that to happen.
And so do they know yet what caused it to pop out?
Not exactly. The Wellington City Council and the building owner are investigating it with a lot of glass experts, and it does seem that it has just shattered quite spontaneously, and these things do happen. They are very rare, but nonetheless they aren't impossible. The glass was in front of a concrete pillar in the building, so it's very unlikely that the shattering came from the inside, so they're still going to continue investigating the cause of it, but it does seem like just one of these things that occasionally just do happen.
Thank you, Kirsty. Keep your wits about you. That is Kirsty Frame outside that building there that had the bit of glass that basically spontaneously combusted from about 20 floors up and hit the ground below. Kia ora e te iwi e haere nei checkpoint. The government's pencilled in a date for primary school to potentially reopen. What might that look like? Pfizer for 5-year-olds plus gets a significant tick from the American authorities. Homai o whakaaro. We would love your feedback on anything you've heard on the program this evening. Do get in touch if it's about school. If you're in Waikato and you've just joined the picnic club, let us know your thoughts. It is time now for the headlines. Ko marama anō tēnei.
Thank you, Lisa. Haka he tai lahi lele. The Education Minister says the goal is still to ensure that all students get back to school by the end of the year. Most secondary schools in Auckland reopened to senior students this week, while the government set an indicative start date of November the 15th for years 9 and 10 students. The Education Minister, Chris Hipkins, who is also the COVID-19 response minister, told Checkpoint it was too early to set any definitive return dates for primary students, but he was hopeful it was possible. He says getting students back in school for even a couple of days a week, if the risk is low enough, should help parents struggling with childcare and work commitments. Mr Hipkins also told the program the government's contract with Pfizer includes the ability to purchase pediatric COVID-19 vaccinations. An expert panel has recommended the US Food and Drug Administration approve the vaccine for children aged from 5 to 11. It still needs further sign-off in the US and then approval from MedSafe. Mr Hipkins says there's not a timeline on the delivery of the pediatric vaccines. Hamilton's mayor says she's still concerned at some people getting a little lax around lockdown, even though she is welcoming news some of the restrictions will be eased from midnight. The city has been in alert level 3 for 3.5 weeks. Paula Southgate says residents will be happier as some businesses can reopen and people can carefully extend their bubbles, but not with the news of 6 new COVID-19 cases in Waikato. The alert level will be reviewed again on Monday. And the government's decision to force local councils to accept its free waters reforms has been mostly met with criticism from the country's mayors. Many have complained the decision is trampling over the principles of local ownership and accountability. Timaru's mayor, Nigel Bowen, however, says the decision is simply a confiscation of over $500 million worth of assets. We'll have more news and sports at 6.
Kia ora rā e hoa nau mai hoki mai. This is Checkpoint. Ko Lisa Owen tēnei. Ko taku hoa e nai nei ko Anand Zaki, who's in our Christchurch studio to talk business. Anand, A2, well, to say it's had a bit of a challenging year is an understatement. So how is it changing things up?
Kia ora, Lisa. Yes, a bit of a rollercoaster year for A2. Of course, it used to be the darling of the stock market when its share price soared, when its infant milk powder took off in China. But they've since come back down to earth with 4 earnings downgrades as sales of those infant formula in China slumped. So it's come out with a refreshed strategy. Chief Executive David Bortolussi spoke at an investors call today, and he said the company's having to adapt to try and rebuild in the China market. So they've said that despite the challenges, there's still an opportunity to grow the market and realise its full potential. They've talked about launching new ranges, innovating across markets, and also invest more money into marketing and the brand itself. But the markets, the share markets that is, clearly not impressed, because A2's share price fell by 11% to or 81 cents at $6.33 today, wiping out all the gains of recent weeks. And at the end of that investor call, there was an opportunity for investment analysts to ask some tough questions and grill the company over its performance. And I'll give you a bit of a flavour of what they asked. Analysts wanted to know where A2 Milk is sitting for its China label infant formula, because the latest trading update shows that sales are significantly down again. And there were also questions around pricing and whether A2 is taking too long to innovate in China while competitors are already innovating. And the company's responded by saying that its China label formula has been constrained to cut back on channel inventory levels, and it's seeing good recovery in pricing. And while on the innovation front, it said that the quality is important, so the development process is naturally long.
And what can you tell us about business confidence and how it's holding up with the lockdown?
Yeah, I mean, would you believe it? The businesses are still pretty upbeat about their outlook despite the lockdown and surging inflation, according to ANZ's monthly confidence survey. But while companies are more confident about their own outlook, there's a lot more pessimism about the broader economy. And perhaps unsurprisingly, cost and inflation pressures intensified further, and there was a sharp jump in inflation expectation, especially around the time of the high consumer price index data release, which was quite expected. ANZ's chief economist Sharon Zollner said that in every sector except services, most firms report higher costs. Now, looking at various sectors, she said manufacturing indicators are up and is above historical averages. In terms of employment indicators, they remain positive almost across the board. So ANZ says despite firms living week to week due to these COVID uncertainties, they are just getting on with it the best they can.
And let's take a quick gallop around the markets.
Yes, the NZX Top 50 Index closed down 55 points or 0.4% to 13,020. The New Zealand dollar is soft across the board, 71.6 US cents, 95.2 Australian and 52 British pence.
Thanks, Anand. Ka kite Anand Zaki there, joining us live from our Christchurch studio with business. Opposition parties are calling for a major overhaul of the way Accident Compensation Corporation handles people's information after staff shared and laughed at people's injuries in a Snapchat group. 12 employees at ACC's call centre in Hamilton have been stood down while the agency investigates. The government's faced tough questions from politicians today about the Crown entity's ability to keep confidential information safe. Anusha Bradley reports.
The revelation that ACC staff shared details of people's injuries and laughed at them in a private Snapchat group has shocked many in the halls of Parliament today. National Party leader Judith Collins says the staff involved should be sacked, and she wants an investigation into how this behaviour was allowed at the organisation that holds very sensitive information about people.
I'm a former minister of ACC. I was so disgusted about that. How could people do that? So they're taking people's private, very personal health information and then having a laugh about it. They should be sacked.
ACT leader David Seymour is disgusted too. He says 1,414 staff have access to sensitive claims which deal with sexual abuse. He says such information should be more closely guarded.
They actually need to ensure that when you share traumatic details with the government, you've got some hope that they'll keep them secret, just as, for example, any private doctor's clinic would be expected to do.
Meanwhile, Meanwhile, the Green Party, with strong support from the health and welfare sector, is calling for a major shake-up to the way ACC safeguards personal and medical information. In an open letter to the new chair of ACC, Steve Mahari, it says recent reports by RNZ of privacy breaches, extensive backlogs and battles to get support shows the agency is letting too many people fall through the cracks and an overhaul is needed. And it was made clear that change was afoot when Labour MP Jan Tinetti, speaking on behalf of the ACC Minister Carmel Sepuloni, answered this question from ACT MP Brooke van Velden.
What is her response to an ACC employee who's put off lodging their own sensitive claim because they do not believe their information would stay private, and who stated, quote, "All of my providers that I've been talking to, therapists and things, they say, it's confidential information, but I work for ACC, so I know it's not."
Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Minister, I am concerned about the claims that are coming forward and have noted that it is clear that ACC does have work to do to reassure New Zealanders that their private information is safe. And as Minister, I have made it clear to ACC that privacy and culture are to be a priority. This, Mr. Speaker, will be in my next letter of expectations, which I will discuss with the new ACC chair.
A former ACC employee who worked in the Hamilton call centre until very recently says the behaviour is not a surprise. Their comments are revoiced.
Sadly, this behaviour is widespread and the Minister's comments are inaccurate. Sensitive claims information was open to any customer service representative. I also witnessed these representatives discuss and joke about injury details every day. Frequent callers were the butt of break room jokes and meeting jibes. Many of the staff are wonderful people, but the culture certainly needs to be addressed.
RNZ has heard from many ACC clients who are worried their privacy has been breached by employees at the agency. RNZ has asked ACC for an update on the investigation.
It is 17 minutes to 6. I'm Lisa Owen and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Hey, Muriaki in Pitapita Kōrero. After the news at 6, some pointers for parents who have hit the wall with homeschooling, many of you managing work at the same time. $200 a year, that's what it's costing your household in order for the Tiwai aluminium smelter to stay open. The Electricity Authority says New Zealanders are subsidising the multinational by about $500 million a year. Our reporter Ruth Hill hit the streets of Wellington to gauge reaction.
There's still a bit of an autumnal nip in the air here in Newtown, and power bills are still too high for most people's liking.
My bills have been going up and down like a diagram of the Himalayas. And being retired and doing the same thing every day, it makes me wonder what's going on.
Power's power and you always got to pay it no matter what. It would be nice if it was cheaper, but I think you just got to do what you have to do.
The power bills have gone up at least $200-300 over the last 4 months that I've noticed. It affects us quite badly because we have to compromise on, is it going to be our power or is it going to be food?
According to the Electricity Authority, it's consumers like these who are paying the price for Meridian and Contact Energy's cut-rate deal with Tiwai's owner, Rio Tinto. The authority's chief executive, James Stevenson Wallace, says the contract, which came into force in January, has led to higher wholesale prices and more coal and gas-fired generation.
The arrangements could be wasteful. The subsidy maintains demand and keeps prices high in the wholesale market, and households might be individually paying up to $200 more per year as a result.
Meridian Energy Chief Executive Neil Barclay says the Electricity Authority has got its figures wrong.
We're very confident that we're not selling to the smelter below cost. In the real world, we would have seen transmission constraints would have meant that most of the generation from Manapuri and the Clutha schemes would have been spilled.
Neil Barclay says in any case, household users on fixed price contracts are largely insulated from big spikes in wholesale prices. However, many electricity retailers have been critical of the power wielded by the big generators. Electric Kiwi Chief Executive Luke Blinko says Meridian is simply too big.
Which really means that they can have an incentive and the ability to exercise market power to increase wholesale prices, and they flow through to consumers. So the impact to consumers is over multiple years, hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars.
The Chief Executive of Consumer, John Duffy, notes Tiwai consumes 13% of New Zealand's electricity, which gives it leverage that the average householder does not have. However, the Electricity Authority is now seeking submissions on its findings.
If we think that actually that's too much market power for one company to have, then we should feed that back to the Electricity Authority, and hopefully they will think carefully about whether, in fact, Meridian is too big.
Otago University public health researcher Kimberly O'Sullivan, who studies fuel poverty, says it's the poor who pay the highest price for power because it takes the biggest chunk out of their incomes.
They're making choices around whether they are going to have a hot shower today or maybe cook a hot meal, those kind of choices that we really don't want people to be making at all. We can't keep overlooking the fact that people just can't afford the basic amount of electricity that they need.
And on the streets of Newtown, there's anger that Rio Tinto is being subsidised by ordinary householders doing it hard.
But I'm angry. I think they should just go now. We just should close Tiwai. Sorry about the people that are going to lose their jobs, but we can't be held over a barrel year after year by some foreign multinational who are just ripping us off. No, close it.
The power supply contract between the power generators and the smelter does not expire until 2024. There's still no certainty for parents and teachers of young children in Auckland and Waikato about when they'll go back to face-to-face learning and if it will happen this year. The Education Minister, Chris Hipkins, says Cabinet's agreed a possible return date of the 15th of November, but has also stressed it's only a possible date and plenty of issues need to be ironed out. Stephen Lethbridge, the principal of Point Chevalier Primary School and the president of Auckland Primary Principals Association, joins us now. Kia ora, Stephen.
Kia ora, Lisa.
What level of confidence do you have that kids will be back in the classroom face-to-face by the 15th of November?
Well, look, as the Minister said, it's an indicative date. So all we can do is look at planning for that possibility. We'll be working with the Ministry in the coming days to see what the rules, what the requirements are, and we can move forward from there.
Did you get a heads up about the date before it was announced this afternoon?
Hey, look, we heard with everyone else. We had met with the Ministry last week, and we had said to the Ministry that if there was any consideration for opening schools in the Auckland region, that we wanted to be part of the discussion and the operationalising of that, if that's even a word. We wanted to be part of that conversation so that the people on the ground had a say in how we do that safely.
Okay, so you want a hand in the rules of engagement, right? So from your point of view, how do you see this working? If kids are coming back on the 15th, what do you want to see in place?
So what we need to see is some clear guidelines around, especially from the health perspective, around what is that gold standard of coming back to school. Now, there's some things that have been put out there. Dr. Jen Russell's got a really good plan in place. NIWA has some really good research around ventilation. So we're just really keen to engage with the Ministry around what that might be, what the requirements are, and then how we can translate that into daily life in schools. That may be a staggered group of children coming into school. We might see school opening up, but it might not be the school that people would be used to.
I know it's early days, but when the Minister talks about staggered schools, how do you see that? Would that mean, say, some kids come Monday, Wednesday and Friday and the others come on another rotation? And what happens when they're not physically in the classroom? Do they keep learning on their device at home, or how do you see it working?
Yeah, these are the things that we need to iron out. I sort of hark back to the days of carless days. There may be schoolless days for some cohorts of kids. And so what would happen is we'd need to work that out, what the parameters are, whether there are children that are on site for a couple of days a week and then there's some learning that's given to them to carry them on for the rest of the week. All of those options are on the table. Nothing is in concrete yet. We're going to be working with the Ministry to make sure that we've got the best for all schools in the Auckland region.
If you do get back on that date, you basically get a month of learning, don't you, face-to-face, before you break up for the year?
Yeah, we do. We get a month to reconnect, to check in with the kids. They've had 10 weeks out of school, and you know, in a very disruptive time for them. So yeah, it's really important that we get to see them at some stage.
So how critical is that month in terms of what you will do there? Is it about re-socialising the kids? Is it about setting them up for next year? Or what would you be aiming for? What's your top priority for that month if it happens?
Yeah, look, I think each school will look at that differently, taking into account the communities that they serve. They know their communities, they know their school and what the needs are. What will happen is that schools will assess, okay, so what are the needs for our children coming back in? That's what we're going to tackle. We've got to remember that, you know, there's a cohort of kids coming through our primary and intermediate schools. You know, we've got some year sixes that will leave primary schools at the end of this year. We've got year eights leaving intermediate schools. So, you know, there's priorities around those leaving stages that need to be taken into account. So I think that we'll be looking at socialising, getting back to how we learn at school, reconnecting with people at school, reconnecting with teachers, and moving on with learning as needed.
We're being told all the time that COVID's with us now, right? So we're learning to live with that, which potentially means there could be periods in the future where you can't be in the classroom, you're back to home learning. And what we're hearing from some primary schools is they've got 50-60% absenteeism on digital devices, kids not logging in. So what other resources do you need for schools that are not still fully equipped to help their kids learn from home?
Yeah, look, the digital divide is a crucial discussion that we have to have. And it's not just having access to a device, it's solid, stable connection in the home. So that's a whole other conversation that needs to happen. We're talking with the ministry around, you know, is there some sort of, in case of lockdown, rip this package open and off you go type approach? And that gives some clarity and certainty in the short term whilst the remote learning programs kick off again.
Stephen, sorry to interrupt.
Sure.
Sorry to interrupt, but we're basically 2 years into this, right? We're 2 years into this. So has the Ministry of Education failed some of our children?
Look, we've had 2 years of interruptions. What we've had is we've had constant calls around the digital divide. Now, look, schools had the lockdown last year, and some schools chose to spend devices on money, some didn't. You know, so there have been device rollouts. What we do need, though, to address is the disparity that we've got currently with access to the internet and access to devices.
Really appreciate your time, Stephen. Stephen Lethbridge there, who's the principal of Point Chef Primary School and also the president of the Auckland Primary Principals Association. A lot of you have been getting in touch about this, so I'll get to some of your feedback. This listener says, gutted to hear that there's no clear plan or urgency to get the year 9 and 10s back to school, especially as many in this age group will be vaccinated. That's from Suzanne, who's a mum, she says, to a 9-year-old student. Another listener says, I would love for my children to go back to school. They need to go back to school, and the risks to children and vaccinated teachers are minimal. But having children only in school for a few days a week simply will not work. What about the other half of school at home? Will online learning continue for them? And if so, who is teaching them at school? It feels like this has been cobbled together by someone who has never set foot in a school. Open schools now to all, this listener says. Do keep your feedback coming. Text us on 2101 or tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ. The Pfizer COVID-19 vaccine, which we get in New Zealand, could soon be available for young American children. The US Food and Drug Administration's advisors have recommended authorising the shot for 5 to 11-year-olds. It's based on the fact families are particularly vulnerable to COVID. Here's the ABC's Catherine Diss with more on the FDA trial's findings.
1, 2, 3.
Back of the queue, but key to closing a critical gap in America's vaccine offensive.
Go ahead and take your mask off for me.
And we're going to put this underneath your jaw, okay? So just open. So go ahead and relax your arm.
Around 2,200 children aged 5 to 11 have undertaken the Pfizer-BioNTech trial in the United States, Finland, Poland and Spain. Amanda Dropic didn't hesitate to sign up her 4 children.
If it's something that I can prevent with a vaccine that's both safe and effective, that's my job, to protect my kids and other people's kids to the best of my ability.
The trial found the vaccine was 91% effective at preventing symptomatic COVID-19. FDA Deputy Director Doran Fink.
The VRTAC is convened today to discuss whether available data support that the benefits of the Pfizer-BioNTech COVID-19 vaccine outweigh its risks when administered as a 2-dose primary series to children 5 through 11 years of age.
The agency's vaccine chief, Peter Marks, says contrary to popular belief, the disease is dangerous to children.
Far from being spared from this harm of COVID-19, in the 5 to 11-year-old age range, there have been over 1.9 million infections, over 8,300 hospitalizations, about a third of which have required intensive care unit stays, and over 2,500 cases of multi-system inflammatory disorder from COVID-19. And there have also been close to 100 deaths, making it one of the top 10 causes of death in this age range during this time.
The panel's recommendation will go to the Centres for Disease Control and Prevention, which will make the final call most likely next week.
To be clear, today's discussion is going to be about the scientific data that are presented, and it's not about vaccine mandates, which are left to other entities outside of FDA.
Getting shots into the arms of children will bolster America's COVID defences as the Northern Hemisphere heads into winter. A crucial layer of protection with kids now back in the classroom.
That report by the ABC's Catherine Diss. The Queen will not attend the massive climate change summit in Glasgow after being told to rest by her doctor. The 95-year-old monarch was in hospital last Wednesday after cancelling a visit to Northern Ireland. Buckingham Palace is playing down fears, saying the Queen is in good spirits. The BBC's Johnny Diamond has more.
This time last week, a reception for business leaders at Windsor. Then, a trip to Northern Ireland was cancelled and a visit to the hospital substituted. Today, it was back to official engagements where a beaming Queen gave a virtual audience to the new Korean ambassador. But this evening, a palace statement. Her Majesty has regretfully decided she will no longer travel to Glasgow to attend the evening reception of COP26. Her Majesty is disappointed not to attend the reception, but will deliver an address to the assembled delegates via a recorded video message.
I'm quite sure what she's got at the back of her mind is that she wants to be absolutely fine and fighting fit on November the 14th, which is Remembrance Sunday. That is the most sacred day in her calendar. But I think to go to Glasgow to stand in a room full of coughing, wheezing delegates from all over the world is probably an engagement too far.
The message from the palace tonight: remain calm. The Queen is still carrying out official engagements. She spoke to the Chancellor about his budget just a few hours ago, and she will address the delegates to the conference, albeit by video. The journey to Glasgow, however, was just too long for her doctor's liking. The climate change conference is close to the Queen's heart. When opening the Welsh Senedd a couple of weeks ago, she was overheard complaining about those who hadn't said whether they'd turn up. And the Queen's absence is a blow for the conference and its organiser, the government. Meeting the Queen is an experience few turn down, even fewer forget. Her absence will take a little shine off a meeting beset with challenges.
And that's Johnny Diamond in London. After the news at 6, we'll have a parenting expert on to give some advice about, well, how you can cope with the extra weeks of homeschooling while you're juggling work as well. Some tips.
RNZ News at 6 o'clock. I'm Marama Tipole. The Education Minister says COVID case numbers will affect plans to reopen primary schools and kura in Level 3. The government has said they might be allowed to reopen on November the 15th. Chris Hipkins told Checkpoint that date is achievable so long as there is no spike in case numbers.
If we see our case numbers stable, and if we see that we're, managing case numbers in a way that, gives us confidence that we can get kids back at school with the risk being relatively low and with those extra protective measures in place, then I think that 15th is absolutely a deliverable time frame.
Chris Hipkins says it's likely children in years 9 and 10 will be allowed back at secondary schools when older students begin their end-of-year exams. 74 new cases were recorded in the community today, 68 in Auckland and 6 in Waikato. The government is still working through details on changes to the managed isolation system, but will make an announcement on its future tomorrow. It had been expected to announce any changes today, but the COVID-19 response minister told Checkpoint the announcement will set out a roadmap for its future management rather than make an immediate overhaul. Chris Hipkins says he cannot guarantee any changes to MIQ before Christmas. A Waikato community leader says the Te Awamutu cluster could happen anywhere and rural towns should remain vigilant. Parts of Waikato and King Country will remain in alert level 3 until at least Monday, but there will be a slight easing of restrictions at midnight. Waipa District Deputy Mayor Liz Stolwick says the effects of lockdown on businesses and mental health are crippling.
What's happened here in Te Awamutu, it could have happened to any provincial town. We have just been unlucky to have had, level 3 lockdowns in place for longer than many other parts of New Zealand.
Liz Stolwick believed the cluster of 35 cases in Te Awamutu was under control and lockdown restrictions could have eased to level 2. Some lockdown-weary Aucklanders want the Prime Minister to show face as the city hits 10 weeks under lockdown. Jacinda Ardern has previously said she doesn't need to visit and understand the restrictions' impact on the region, although she did say today she is considering a visit. Aucklander Neem McMillan is among those who think it'd help her understand what Aucklanders are living through. But Auckland Councillor, Manukau Ward Representative Efeso Collins thinks local senior ministers should step up and be more visible, while Ms Ardern focuses on running the country. A kaiawhina for Te Tii Marae in Waitangi says anti-vax protesters have not taken away the focus of commemorations there today. The anniversary of the He Whakaputanga Declaration of Independence has been marked at the marae. COVID-19 protesters came from parts of Northland to join, and the pōwhiri at midday called for calm. Te Tii Kaiawhina Waireti Paura says so far people have listened, and that's an absolute relief. She says anyone wanting to acknowledge He Whakaputanga can come, but COVID-19 protests won't be tolerated. Police remain on site to ensure compliance with health orders. The Timaru District Mayor says the government is confiscating more than $500 million worth of assets by pushing through its 3 water reforms. The government today announced that it will create 4 publicly owned water entities, taking over responsibility from local authorities. Nigel Bowen says the decision is a sad shift away from the principles of local ownership and accountability.
Confiscation of for us, over $500 million worth of assets, and, government is saying its ownership remains with council, but it doesn't give you the same rights of traditional ownership, if you like. So there's some really big concerns that haven't been worked through.
Nigel Bowen says the council's consultation showed 97% of respondents were opposed to the change. The local government minister says every council must take part as the status quo is not good enough. One of America's most influential satirists of the 1950s and 60s, Mort Sahl, has died aged 94. He distinguished himself via his social and political commentaries on the Eisenhower era. He's credited with helping satire go mainstream, appearing on television and influencing comedians on both sides of the Atlantic. Napier is experiencing its hottest October day since 1998. It's been the hottest place in the country today as the Hawke's Bay region experiences a spring heat wave. Met Service meteorologist Angus Hines says the Napier Airport weather station recorded a high of nearly 28 degrees. A weather station in the city centre recorded 29 degrees, but the station has only been around for a few years, so records did not go back as far. Mr Hines says the air over the North Island is humid and the east coast is getting warm winds through from the mountains. It's 6:05. Football Ferns coach Jitka Klimklava was impressed by the much improved performance of her side in the second clash against the Olympic champions Canada in Montreal this afternoon. New Zealand came close to snatching a draw before eventually losing 1-0 after being completely outplayed 5-1 in the first match at the weekend. She says the side is coachable.
It was a different approach today. We defended on our front foot. We put the pressure on the ball straight away, and we won the ball a little bit closer to the opposition goal, which led us to creating more chances and being more dangerous in these games.
The All Blacks are confident this weekend's test against Wales and Cardiff will go ahead despite a Welsh player testing positive for COVID-19. The former Hurricanes midfielder Willis Halaholo was expected to play for Wales on Sunday, but he's tested positive for COVID and left the Welsh camp. The All Blacks assistant coach John Plumtree says the team learnt of Halaholo's situation this morning and he still expects the match at the sold-out 75,000 seats Millennium Stadium will proceed.
There will be all sorts of talk around the game and is it in jeopardy, but the player that's been tested with COVID's obviously dropped out of the environment. They'll get tested. Obviously, they'll all have to be negative before they can play on the weekend. But yes, for us, it's just business as usual.
John Plumtree says the All Blacks were all tested again last night. Yena tātou telefo, Morne, that's the news.
Tonight on Nights, Harry McNaughton, co-creator of The Pact, a family TV drama about euthanasia. Gay Buckingham on her new novel for young adults, Kakapo Keeper, based on the pioneer Fiordland bird keeper Richard Henry and an imaginary teenage assistant. And speaking of wildlife, this week's Hump Prize is Wild Fathers, while we human dads can learn about bringing up the kids from other male animals, maybe even goats, on Nights after the news at 7 on RNZ National.
Now the short forecast from Met Service to midnight Thursday, ka kikila ki te tala o te tau mo te whenua Northland, Auckland and Coromandel Peninsula. Mostly cloudy with isolated showers but fine spells this evening. Waikato to Hanganui, also Bay of Plenty and the Central High Country. Often cloudy with rain at times. For Gisborne, cloud increasing. Rain developing tomorrow afternoon. Manawatu and Hawke's Bay to Marlborough and Westland north of Fox Glacier. Scattered light rain or drizzle. Heavier and more widespread for a time tomorrow with thunderstorms possible in the South Island. For the remainder of Westland and Fiordland, cloudy periods and a few showers. Canterbury, Otago and Southland, low cloud or fog in the east and elsewhere tomorrow morning. Scattered showers in the afternoons and evenings with isolated thunderstorms and hail from South Canterbury to Southland today. And for the Chatham Islands, low cloud or fog, occasional drizzle today. It's 6:08.
Kia ora rā, e hono mai hoki mai. This is Checkpoint, ko Lisa Owen tēnei. It's not quite schools out for summer, but there's still no set time frame for when all students stuck in Level 3 will return to the classroom. Education Minister Chris Hipkins has indicated that primary school students could be back from the 15th of November, but they're still working out the details. It's likely different year groups will attend on different days, but years 9 and 10 are in a grey area, with more advice being sought on how they could return whilst older students are taking their NCEA exams. So what effect does this all have on children? The uncertainty and how do you keep them motivated? Well, we're joined now by parenting expert Nathan Wallace. Kia ora, Nathan.
Kia ora, Lisa. Ngā mihi nui kia koe.
So, for all those parents who can absolutely feel the panic rising and think their children's education hopes are dashed forever and cannot face a single other day managing work and virtual learning, what is the most important thing you can tell them?
That it's all right that you feel that way. It's perfectly normal that you feel that way, and everybody else feels that way too. It's okay to feel like, you've had enough, because I think everyone feels that way. And the other thing is that it is only, half a year, or however long it's been. It's not their whole childhood. Humans and children in general are pretty resilient. So I think don't overly panic. It's going to have a different impact on different age group kids and different individuals, but there's no reason why it should be a disaster.
Okay, well, let's look at some of those factors then.
Okay.
For younger children, so let's say 8 and under, does it matter that they may have, been doing slightly patchy learning for this period of time?
No, I think it's actually a blessing. Children under 8 are better off just playing and not really doing formal learning. I know that surprises a lot of people, but it's just a research-based reality. Whether your kid learns to read at 4 or whether they learn to read at 7, after the age of 8, no one can tell for the rest of their life. So there is no advantage in doing formal literacy, numeracy, all the school-type stuff until really, after the age of 7, somewhere between 7 and 8. Scandinavian countries get the best educational outcomes, and they just let the children play until they're 7. So I think for the kids under 8, lockdown could actually be a blessing. It might not be for the parents, but it is for the kids.
So, okay, if you've got a child that age and you accept the research that you've just presented, what activities are you best to kind of occupy their time with that might have the dual benefit of A, keeping them amused, and B, while learning stuff by osmosis?
Yep, absolutely. The key is think creativity and think open-ended learning. Try not to give them topics or activities that have one outcome. Like a puzzle. There's only one way to do a puzzle. Instead, have a hut building competition in the lounge. So there's no right and wrong way of building a hut in the lounge. Build a dam in the creek down the back. Do those open-ended creative things that don't have a right or wrong way of doing it. That's really what sets our children up to be resilient. Like the more creative play you have under the age of 8, the less statistical chance there is of anxiety and depression as a teenager.
Okay.
And it's all about that open-ended stuff.
Then we've got the slightly older kids, right? Say the young teenagers. What is there any benefit for them for going through this home learning process?
There could be, especially for the older teenagers and for some of the younger teenagers, is that they're going to learn to self-manage, which is about self-control and self-regulation. The Dunedin multidisciplinary study, that's world famous, that was able to prove that the number one factor that determines how well a human being does, beyond how rich your parents are or how qualified they are or beyond all of that, the number one factor is self-control. The ability to control yourself. So these kids are having an opportunity to really practice self-control. They're, online learning. They've got to regulate themselves. It doesn't mean we should leave them to do it alone because, they are still children. That's why we have childhood. We're going to have to help them self-regulate. But for a lot of those kids, it's going to be quite beneficial. They're going to take ownership of their learning, do some more time management. Admittedly, other children are probably not ready for that and are going to, fall through the cracks and not bother doing the work and possibly fall behind. It's going to be a mix.
So, Nathan, how do you help them do that without being a sort of enforcement officer?
Yeah, it is hard to avoid the enforcement officer. If you want to parent without being the enforcement officer, be a grandparent. As a parent, you have to do some enforcement, don't you? But the trick is to try and help them to help themselves. Rather than you saying, come on, it's 2 o'clock, you've got to get online for that learning. Maybe at 1 o'clock say, I know you've got that maths lesson at 2 o'clock, mate. Here, I'll set the alarm here at 10 to 2, so that goes off because I'm going to be working on the computer, and then you'll know to get your stuff ready at 2 o'clock, at 10 to 2. And then he or she's still taking responsibility when the alarm goes off to go to the computer, but you've helped them, you've set them up for success by setting the alarm for them. It's that sort of thing. Help them to help themselves rather than do it for them.
Okay, so outside the academic issues that this creates, let's refer to it as the feral factor. There is concern among some parents that their children they won't be socialised. And I've actually had people say that with the expansion of the bubble, we'll see you, but I can't guarantee good behaviour from XYZ child because they're not used to socialising anymore.
Right, okay. I think that's more of an extreme example because I think, they've had their whole life to socialise and this has just been, a few months. It does have an impact and I can see them going into their shell and they need a bit of practice. So I understand where that parent's coming from. When they first go out, they might, have to oil the cogs. But yeah, I think the kids are still in contact through social media, aren't they? So they're not completely isolated.
Yeah, but that's a funny old thing, isn't it? There's different sort of visual cues, there's different...
Yeah.
It's different to face. So is there a way to maintain those kind of social skills at a distance?
Yeah, there is. I mean, you have to use social media. There's no way around that. I mean, I'm more cautious than most people about social media. I think people aren't really aware of just how dangerous it is and how badly it interacts with our brains. But in a situation like lockdown, you need to use those things. Those teenagers especially need social contact. So I think it's just about using it intelligently. You don't have to be sitting in front of the screen, staring at the screen to use social media. You can have a group of friends, have it on the computer and carry on what you're doing around the house with the volume up and be focused more on the verbal aspects. You don't have to be sitting down in front of the computer. I think it's good for parents to be aware that there is a correlation between the more time your children are on screens in childhood, the more chance there is they'll have anxiety and depression as a teenager. But you can protect your children from that by simply giving them 2 hours a day device-free time. If your kids, my kids would do it from 3 to 5, and that was 5 to 7. Actually, 5 to 7, they'd give me their cell phones. There was no TV. That's when we cooked tea, interacted. If you can have 2 hours where your kids don't have devices, that completely takes them outside the at-risk group for anxiety and depression. So use social media, but also make sure every day there's 2 hours device-free time, and then you're winning.
Great to talk to you, Nathan. Thanks for joining us. That is Nathan Wallace there, parenting expert. I wonder if we should have a tent building competition in the office at Checkpoint. It is 6:15 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. More information. That's what some Auckland businesses are calling for after the government announced businesses using the vaccine certificate must have fully vaccinated staff. And as the city desperately tries to get 90% of the population double dosed to gain some freedom, some feel there's a disconnect between those locked down and the decision makers. Our reporter Jean Bell and camera operator Marika Habazi hit the streets.
Vaccine certificates are about to become the ticket to work and play for many. To be able to operate at the orange and red levels of the new traffic light system, many businesses will need both employees and customers to prove their vaccination status. Handpicked coffee cafe owner Nara Lee is vaccinated and so are her staff, but she's hesitant about enforcing a no jab, no service policy.
I'm happy I can say that I'm fully vaccinated, but I don't want to push them. Only people can get it with a vaccinated certificate.
Mount Albert Barbecue Noodle House manager Alice Liu says all the staff are on track to get double dosed, but she wants clearer guidelines about how vaccine certificates will work.
How they will be scanned and they have 2 doses already, or how should we control the people already having the 2 of those injections.
She thinks it'd be good for the Prime Minister to visit and see the economic carnage of the lockdowns.
They can listening how this happened and lockdown and how it's infected to our life and how hard it is.
Donnie Ching is among the small business owners struggling in lockdown, having already sold 2 businesses in the CBD after they were decimated by the city rail link construction and the pandemic. He thinks the government is disconnected from Auckland business owners.
Every business owners are suffering at the moment. She definitely need to come more to Auckland to meeting the communities.
Manukau Ward Councillor Efeso Collins agrees there's a bit of a disconnect.
My complaint is that I'd like to see a bit more connection between, say, Auckland and Wellington so that we're making these decisions together. The Prime Minister needs to be looking at who her sources of intelligence are, and we really need to be looking at Auckland to say, well, who else is there? How else are we going to make decisions and impactful decisions that reach deep into the crevices of our community? We know that it's in areas like mine where we're finding it really hard to get people vaccinated. That's where it matters today.
He thinks Auckland-based ministers should follow Auckland Council representatives' lead and be more present in the community.
There's senior ministers of cabinet who should be doing it who are based in Auckland, and I would encourage them to get out and about. We can't all depend on Jacinda Ardern to come to every part of the community.
But he thinks the Prime Minister will be well informed and should stay focused on the big picture.
I think there's a part of Auckland that would really relish the opportunity to sit down with her, but she's got a country to run.
But out in Mount Albert today, many want the local MP, who happens to be Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, to come home for a visit. Nee McMillan thinks it'd help her understand what Aucklanders are living through.
It'd be really beneficial for her, from like a leadership point of view, to kind of see how we're all living.
Ms McMillan, who's a nanny, says lockdown fatigue is setting in and Aucklanders aren't following the rules as they should.
For the young kids especially, like I don't know how sustainable this way of living is, and I think it's all well and good seeing it displayed on the TV, like through these interviews and stuff like that, but it's another thing to actually walk around and kind of see the impact it's got on everyone.
Felicity Reid would also like to see Jacinda Ardern show face.
It's been so long and she needs to come and visit and see how people are coping with it, because some people are not doing that well.
She thinks it'd make the Prime Minister appreciate the impact of the lockdowns.
I think it would show like more of an understanding of what we're going through, because you can see stuff on social media but it doesn't really represent, what's happening.
Aucklanders will move to red on the new traffic light system once all 3 Metro DHBs reach 90% vaccinated. But Cabinet will consider moving the city and Waikato to the next level 3 step on Monday.
Singapore has been added to the list of holiday destinations for Australian tourists. From November the 8th, fully vaccinated people can travel between the two countries without having to quarantine. The Australian government expects a significant influx of students, workers and tourists from Singapore. The ABC's David Lipsam has more.
After 18 months of relative silence, the phones at Mossman Travel in Sydney sprung into life last week, and Managing Director Sharon Kitchener is expecting even greater demand from wannabe holidaymakers today.
I received an email last night at 9:37pm letting us know that Singapore and Australia are good to go.
She was at work just after 6 this morning to prepare.
Singapore has been on everyone's radar.
After the government announced Australians will be able to travel there from November 8th without needing to quarantine. Is there certainty that the door won't slam shut?
No, not really. I guess that's always on everyone's mind. If the borders close, what happens? From the government, what they've said to us is they don't want to do that to us again. And I don't think our industry and a lot of other industries can afford nor cope with that.
Look, there is certainty for Australians that want to travel.
Tourism Minister Dan Tehan has welcomed the agreement with Singapore after months of negotiations.
It's wonderful news. They don't have to quarantine. They'll just have to do a test before they go and one upon arrival.
He says Singapore's status as a gateway city means the arrangement will open up more international destinations for Australian tourists and make it easier for Australians and their families overseas trying to get home. But for now, the travel lane isn't open to foreign students, tourists or workers.
We want to make sure that the seats on those flights are available to Australians first coming back to Australia, and then we will follow with international students, obviously working holiday visa makers and our agricultural visa workforce. We're in negotiations and discussions with the Singaporean government about that. We'll be making some announcements with regards to Singaporeans travelling to Australia in the coming days.
Will it be weeks away, months away? Could we expect arrivals before Christmas, for example?
Oh, look, I well and truly expect arrivals before Christmas.
The tourism sector may not be ready for an influx of overseas arrivals. Research from the Tourism and Transport Forum has found that around a quarter of tourism-related businesses don't have enough staff to cater for pent-up demand from international and domestic travellers.
Australia yesterday laid out its commitment to net zero emissions by 2050, but exactly how that'll happen is unclear. Prime Minister Scott Morrison has said about $20 billion more will be invested in climate-friendly technologies over the next decade. Yet industry groups want more detail. The ABC's Claudia Long has more.
The energy sector is the largest source of emissions in Australia, so it's crucial to the government's commitment to reach net zero emissions by 2050.
There's no silver bullet in the Australian electricity sector. There's a lot of moving parts.
Sarah McNamara is the Chief Executive of the Australian Energy Council, which represents some of the country's biggest power and gas companies.
We've been publicly committed to a net zero by 2050 target for some time now, so this is an opportunity for conversations to be begin with other sectors of the economy, which are yet to start looking at decarbonisation opportunities.
The government is promising more investment in low-cost solar energy and hydrogen projects to help slash emissions.
We would certainly look forward to engaging with more detail and to having conversations with the government about the role we are playing already. But from the electricity sector's perspective, we are already doing more than our fair share of the heavy lifting.
The challenge we should all rally around is aggressively reducing the costs of clean electricity.
Ben Eade is the CEO of Manufacturing Australia, a group representing companies that make products including cement, aluminium, fertilisers, paint and bricks.
In a manufacturing context, decarbonisation is a lot more like a downward staircase than a straight line. So what we really need to see is some of these breakthrough technologies mature and become commercially viable.
Technology is the buzzword in the plan, with the government saying existing and emerging technologies will get the country 85% of the way to net zero. Priorities are clean hydrogen, battery storage of renewable power and ultra-low-cost solar. But some of the technologies, including carbon capture and sequestration, remain largely unproven.
It's important that we do focus on emerging technologies, but emerging technologies have an element of uncertainty in them.
Professor Hugh Bradlow is the president of the Australian Academy of Technology and Engineering. He wants to see more detail about how the 2050 net zero target will be reached.
We need to see the regulatory framework they're going to put in place to make that happen.
While the government's finally committed to net zero by 2050, it's the 2030 target that'll be much the focus of the UN climate talks in Glasgow. And the government isn't going to budge from its commitment to reduce emissions by 26 to 28%, even though its own projections suggest the country will in fact have reduced emissions by up to 35% by the end of the decade. Erwin Jackson from the Investor Group on Climate Change says when other countries are promising much more, that's a problem.
The big concern to investors is the lack of clarity on the 2030 target, because investors want to invest in the short term, not just in the long term. We're in a global race, and without strong 2030 targets, investors are going to be looking for those opportunities in other markets.
One of the world's most well-known conservation advocates says world leaders have a final chance to take serious action against climate change. Sir David Attenborough says the world's richest nations have a moral responsibility to help the poorest. He spoke to the BBC's David Shookman.
This is a thermal camera, and it will tell me the difference between the surrounding temperature and the temperature in the centre of a daisy flower. The surroundings, 12 degrees. In the centre of the flower, 21.
New technology to film the humble daisy.
And action, David.
At Kew Gardens in London, we had rare access behind the scenes to the making of Green Planet.
But it looks like you get a lot of enjoyment out of making these programmes.
Well, they're all old friends, aren't they? It's the nice thing.
We caught up with David Attenborough several times during the filming, and he seemed most passionate about the most ordinary of plants.
Daisies are things that you decapitate with your lawnmower sort of once a week. But actually they are marvellous things, and they move every day. They exploit the sunshine and open to the sunshine. The interesting thing is we now have a camera which allows us to actually explore the surface of a plant in great detail. So it's like moving into a different landscape. Like suddenly this thing is a huge, great thing, and you suddenly see it for what it is.
I've been reporting on climate change, climate science for nearly 20 years, and I've seen some spectacular advances in understanding in that time. What most strikes you about the changes you've seen?
I think that the devastating fires around the world, in Australia and California, all over the place, that has brought home the real catastrophe that happens to ordinary people in their secure home. Every time I see it on television, I think, suppose suddenly now there were flames coming up, that everything, my life in my house and everything about it is going up in flames. What would that do to you? It would destroy you.
When you think of the poorest countries.
And that report was by the BBC's David Shookman. Let's get to some of your feedback before we head off. Our interview with the COVID response minister, who's the education minister, pretty polarising. This person says the minister is so patronising, wanting to get the kids out of the house for a bit. Please, what about desperately wanting to get our kids back into a proper learning environment? That's what parents want. On the other hand, Bill's got in touch to say, I can't help but be very impressed with how capable Chris Hipkins is over both his portfolios. The Delta version is very tricky and a moving target. Chris Hipkins is working extremely hard to keep everyone safe. Trish, though, says COVID has shown how good people are at spinning words and giving downright bullshit. That is all we've got time for. The Late News team will keep you updated throughout the night. Ko te kaupapa tuatahi a popo. And tomorrow from 5 a.m, First Up speaks to Deputy Prime Minister Grant Robertson about whether Air New Zealand will require vaccinations for domestic travel in time for Christmas. Back tomorrow.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. The Education Minister has told Checkpoint opening schools on November the 15th is achievable as long as there isn't a spike in COVID-19 case numbers. Mr Hipkins, who is also the COVID-19 response minister, says any changes to managed isolation due to be announced tomorrow are not guaranteed to be in place before Christmas. The Director General of Health says there are several more steps before any final approval to roll out a COVID-19 vaccine for children. And the country's mayors are up in arms at being forced to accept the government's 3 waters reforms. Those are the headlines. Our next news and weather is at 7.
We have a huge countdown clock in front of our Olay Sports Complex, and everybody's keeping an eye on it.
This week on Champions of the Pacific, the Northern Mariana Islands are not letting COVID-19 slow their preparations for hosting the Pacific Mini Games in 2022. And the first Pacific Island woman to win a pro singles tennis title is immortalised in the United States.